Díobh Gachtain, hello everyone. You're really welcome to the alternative to Scoil gCláirseach 2020, the festival of early Irish harp which normally takes place each August in Kilkenny in Ireland. Between the 13th and 17th of August 2020, we'll be joining together each day to watch a talk, a workshop and concert footage from previous Scoilna. Find out more on our website at irishharp.org. It's day 2, Friday the 14th of August. Welcome to our first talk of the day.
So there's going to be 3 parts of this talk, and we're going to go in 3 directions from our friend Patrick Byrne, who marketed himself in the 19th century as the last of the old Irish harpers. This is very interesting that he's the last, because he had no students. None of them at this time had any students. They did not pass the tradition on to their next generation, and so it came to an end. And this is kind of an interesting thing about an old tradition if it comes to an end, because that's what we're here for, is to work out how to revivify something that's gone away. Anyway, so we're going to start with Patrick Byrne, and we're going to go backwards in time. So Patrick Byrne is kind of after the end of the old Irish harp tradition. I mean, Patrick Byrne was a native Irish speaker, but I'm interested in how much or little of the truly indigenous tradition he had. I don't think he had traditional Gaelic Irish features in the way his harp was tuned. I wonder about his technique and all this kind of thing. But he learned from Arthur O'Neill, who absolutely was one of the genuine old tradition bearers at the end of the 18th century. Arthur O'Neill wrote his biography, so we can read the memoirs of Arthur O'Neill, which is a wonderful account in English of life on the road as a travelling Irish harper in the 18th century. And you can see this wonderful portrait of Arthur O'Neill sitting with his big harp, with his hands placed carefully on the strings. I've shown you a picture of an extant harp that some people claim to be the harp of Arthur O'Neill, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it shows you the kind of instrument maybe. And, you know, this kind of size, similar to this big instrument we have here, with metal wire strings and having that characteristic sound. And Arthur O'Neill gave Edward Bunting a lot of tunes and is a great tradition bearer. Edward Bunting, the music collector, collected from a lot of old Irish harpers at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, a little bit over 200 years ago. This is Patrick Quinn from County Armagh, and Bunting visited him and took down a number of very interesting settings, of very interesting old tunes and song airs. This picture shows a portrait of Patrick Quinn sitting with his harp on the left side, with his right hand reaching down into the bass, leaning his head against the harp to listen to the resonance of the wood. He was blind. His harp is preserved. It's in Trinity College in Dublin, and those of us who are coming on the field trip on Tuesday will get to see it. This is a previous year's field trip where we get special access to a private room to view the harp. And at the top is Edward Bunting's live field transcript of Patrick Quinn's playing. And so I put these together to give you a sense of, this is a little fragment of performance practice in the old native Irish harp tradition from a little bit over 200 years ago. And we could spend all week discussing this slide and the information in it. It's an incredibly rich resource. Here's Edward Bunting, wearing his aviator goggles, about to take off into the unknown. Edward Bunting is one of the most important people in the transmission of the old Irish harp repertory. He was not a harper. He is a classically trained keyboard player, a church organist, highly literate, in the Western classical music tradition, and he was asked to go to the old harpers, to sit with them, to write down their music. Because of course the old Irish harp music was an oral tradition, passed on by ear, by memorization, by improvisation. And so Edward Bunting was fascinated by the music of these old men who were clearly at the end of the tradition, who were not nurturing young players, who were a storehouse of traditions, lore, repertory, technique, styles. And so Bunting, over the course of his life, spent many years travelling around Ireland, visiting the last of the harpers, writing down their repertory and their techniques, with the ultimate aim of publishing the tunes for contemporary performance, to keep the repertory alive. And so a lot of people criticise Bunting because he turned the music into fashionable romantic piano arrangements, which are not very Irish in their flavour. But it's unfair to criticise him for that. He had to make a living, he had to get the tunes out into the world and get people to buy them. He worked very conscientiously, meticulously, and he kept all of his field notebooks with his direct transcripts of the playing, and they're preserved and they're kept now at Queen's University in Belfast. And so we can access that first layer of kind of ethnomusicological work into the repertory of the harpers. This is another of the old harpers at the end of the 18th century, Dennis Hampsey, who was 100 years old or so when this engraving was printed. No, he was 113 or more when this was published in 1807. And then at the bottom here is a Scoil field trip to Dublin, and here's Dennis Hampsey's harp, which is in the Guinness Museum, and those of us who are on the field trip on Tuesday will get to see this instrument and see the harp that Dennis Hampsey played. And there at the top is Edward Bunting's field draft live notation of Dennis Hampsey's playing. So again, this combination of the portrait of him sitting at the harp, resting his chin on the top. He has the harp on his left side, with his right hand reaching out into the bass strings. And there's the harp, and you can look at how it's constructed, how it's worn, how it's repaired. And there's the transcript of the actual notes that he played. It's a window into the world of 200 years ago. There were lots of other harpers, but we have less information about them. We have some field transcripts, we have some portraits. This is Turlough Caroline, of course. People say this is Charles Byrne, but I'm not sure I believe them, but I don't know who it is. And people say this is Arthur O'Neill, and that's absolutely rubbish, it's not, but I don't know who it is. And here's some of the harps that we'll see on our field trip to Dublin. This harp is the one that this one is a model of. So our harp makers can go to the museums, they can measure and inspect the museum originals, and they can construct accurate copies or replicas that we can string and we can use to play the music out of Bunting's field notebooks to try and get a direct connection with the old traditions. Looking back further in time, the further back you look, the smaller the harps are, and the less we know about their use and their repertory. Okay? So this harp, we don't know how old it is, but it's 17th century, 16th century, 15th century, perhaps that kind of date. This is an 18th century portrait, but it's clearly an old harp that he's playing. There's a music sheet in the hand of his daughter, but we can't read it because we don't have a good enough photograph of the painting. So there's, this is not like Bunting's transcripts.
Where is the original?
In a private collection.
Oh.
So, no chance. So the further back in time you go, the less you know. This is the basic principle. You go back to medieval times. There are harps. These are two of the medieval harps that survive. And one of the reasons I put this slide together is that this is the famous Brian Boru harp in Trinity College in Dublin. We have no idea how old it is. People guess that it's late medieval. This is the Queen Mary harp in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, recently radiocarbon dated to the 14th century. And you can see that they're like twin sisters, they're almost identical in almost every aspect. And to me, this highlights the connections between Ireland and Scotland. There's not a Scottish harp tradition and an Irish harp tradition. There's a shared Gaelic harp tradition across the old Gaelic world. And it's easy to forget that when we use modern political names for territories and boundaries. So constantly keep in the back of your mind, this is a pan-Gaelic thing. Karen Loomis, who spoke the other day on her dating of the Queen Mary harp, has done a lot of scientific work on that instrument. We wish that somebody or her was going to do more work on the other instruments like the Brian group, but it's not happening yet, but it may yet. This is the kind of work that she's been doing with the Queen Mary harp, sticking it into a hospital CAT scanner. Here's the 14th century Queen Mary harp in the hospital. And here's the X-ray images that we get. You don't see it?
Sorry. It's for the next.
And this is the kind of results that she's getting. You get an amazing amount of technical information. You'll not see anything if you put the specs on yet. Behave yourself. So there's a huge amount of technical work that can be done. This is only on one of the harps, but there's about 18 more waiting to be done. So we have a lot of work ahead of us on that technical side of things. People always want to know what came before. What came before the 14th century? And this is where it gets a bit difficult, because in the 14th century there's this extant object you can X-ray. And before the 14th century there's postage stamp sized cartoons that show figures of people with triangular striky things in front of them. And there are certain things that you can say. You can talk about how his right hand's in the bass and his left hand's in the treble. You can talk about the shape of the fish on the front. But it's a postage stamp sized artist's cartoon. It's not a photorealistic image, let alone an actual instrument. And when you go further back in time, specs please. This is a 3D photograph of the Cross of Murder, Monaster Boys, in the north of Dublin. And you can see that this is one of the oldest harp objects in Ireland from the 9th or 10th century. And you can see it's a harp. There's a person sitting down on a chair with a triangular thing in front of them. But it's been outside for 1,000 years, and it's only a cartoon to start with. And so there's almost nothing you can say from this picture about repertory, technique, tradition, sound, music. All you can say is they had triangular musical instruments 1,000 years ago, which is good to know, but it doesn't take us much further. So that's a trip back in time over almost 1,000 years at rather high speed. Now I want to go forwards in time. You can take your specs off now. Okay. I hope you could all see the 3D picture. If you couldn't, I'm sorry. You can ask me later and we'll work it out. Okay, now I want to go forwards in time. I hope you're all keeping up. This is like Back to the Future, isn't it? We'll get sort of time sick and queasy. So we're going to go forwards in time, and to help us orient ourselves where we are, here's Patrick Byrne again, looking a little bit more serious and ready for action, and wearing a fantastic tartan waistcoat. And so here he is, the last of the old harpers, after the real indigenous oral tradition had come to an end, but it was straggling on, trying to keep it going with the last end of the lineage, and he didn't have any students. Still, he's got his left hand in the treble, he's got his right hand in the bass, he's playing on brass wire strings, he has the repertory of old airs learned from his master, who learned from Arthur O'Neill, etc., etc. His harp, we would call it an early Irish harp because it has brass wire strings. It was made by John Egan in Dublin. Now, John Egan's a very interesting character in the history of the Irish harp. John Egan, he was like a mad inventor. He was a mechanical genius. And this was the time of invention and improvement. And so Egan would do anything he could to improve things, and his thing was harps. So he started out, I don't know when Egan started out, in the very early 1800s, I think. And he started out as a pedal harp maker. Okay? So this is a pedal harp that was made by Egan in Dublin. This one actually was from the 1820s. This is a fairly late example, but it shows you the kind of thing he was making. And it's basically a copy of the English pedal harps that were made by the French company Harp. So it's in that Anglo-French classical tradition. And as far as I can see, I don't know where Egan got this from. I don't know if he went to London to apprentice, or if he bought London-made harps and took them apart and copied them. But that's what Egan is doing. That's what he's selling these to the aristocratic Irish market and doing very well. And he's inventing new mechanisms, and he's inventing acoustical improvements, and he's constantly advertising how well he's doing at improving the pedal harp. And because he's the best harp maker, the harp societies that Byrne learned at approached him and said, "Can you make Irish harps?" And so Egan made Irish harp. This is Patrick Byrne's harp, which is now in a private collection in America. He managed to track it down. This is the best photo I've got of it. But there you go. So this is one of Egan's Irish harps. And you can tell it's an Irish harp because it has metal wire strings, and it's designed to play on the left side, the right-handed bass, etc. And so you can see it's quite a different beast to the pedal harp. Although he can't help improving it and putting in technical improvements from his pedal harp making. And up until 201 years ago, this and this were the only kind of harps in Ireland. And nobody would call this an Irish harp because it's a pedal harp. This is the only kind of Irish harp there was, a harp with metal wire strings. 201 years ago, Egan saw a gap in the market for people who wanted to play Irish-looking harps, but whose musical training was in the classical pedal harp tradition, and so didn't work on metal-strung Irish harps. And so Egan put his inventor's hat on and said, what can we do? We can make something that looks Irish. It's small and curvy and covered in shamrocks, but its strings and its mechanism, seriously, its strings and its mechanism are from this. And so that's why I put this next to this one, because this is a small version of this, but it's named and looks like this one, okay? And this was the greatest marketing move in the history of Irish music, because this thing died out and disappeared, and this thing became known as the Irish harp.
What are those things on the fourth floor?
No.
Ah.
Okay, because this doesn't reach to your feet, and so it's no use presuming for your feet to press. These are for changing keys for the classical key change for the classical repertory. Because this is basically a classical pedal harp without pedals, and it has a single action mechanism for changing keys in the classical tradition and so on. Okay. And for a long time, these were like novelties, and they were kind of interchangeable with the pedal harp because people understood that they were just a small version of the pedal harp. And so for a long time, pedal harps were normal in Irish music. So here's Sarah Curran, who was Robert Emmett's fiancée, and here she is in a portrait with a single action pedal harp. I don't know the date of the portrait. It might be an early Egan harp, but she's clearly wanting to depict herself as some kind of Irish maiden, perhaps even a spirit of Ireland. And so of course she has to have a harp. And of course it's not going to be an Irish harp because she would have no contact with the old Irish harp tradition. She would be in the classical world and would use a pedal harp. I find this very interesting. And that idea carries all the way through. So here's an Irish maiden with a modern harp in a house in Dublin in 1904, I think. And so the use of the pedal harp as a normal thing in Irish music carries on. And about that time, so here's 1907, about 100 years ago, people again become dissatisfied with pedal harps as not looking Irish enough. And so again, there's this idea that you can invent a small harp that looks Irish but works like a pedal harp. And so Florrie O'Connor with a harp made by James McFall in Belfast. And Florrie is, as far as I know, the first person to have made recordings of Irish harp music. And this photograph was taken by the recording person in 1907. And the recordings are basically just classical, harmonic style, you know. It's interesting. And so it carries on. And so Florrie with the classical style, and the harp entered James McFall made a lot of harps for convents, and the nuns played the harps in the classical tradition with the right hand on the treble and the left hand on the bass, and with gut strings, with semitone mechanisms to change keys. And the nuns taught, a lot of influential harp teachers, and I believe Mary O'Hara learnt from the nuns, is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and she was the ambassador for Irish harp, and so here she is in that Anglo-continental tradition of playing on gut strings with the right hand on the treble and the left hand on the bass, and semitone mechanisms on the top of her harp. And so it continues through to the present day, and here's a very recent photograph from the Arts Council report on harping. And this is meant to represent the harp tradition in Ireland today. And so there's loads and loads of people, and they're playing Anglo-continental pedal harp drive tradition. They've got the harps on the right hand of the treble, left hand of the bass, nylon strings nowadays rather than gut, semitone mechanisms, etc.
Simon, to be fair to the Arts Council, that was just one image from the report, and they had other images of early Irish harps.
Well, I know.
So they're not trying to imply this is the only thing. It was just
But this is the mainstream of harping in Ireland
yeah,
today.
absolutely.
I mean, you know, you can argue about what percentage of harping in Ireland is like this, but I'm going to guess 80, 90, 95.
But just to say, they're not presenting this as a monolithic
No.
picture, so it's one image,
No.
to be fair.
I didn't mean to be unfair.
And of course, the harp
So this is...
That's the harp bridge. It's the harp bridge.
Yes, exactly. It's the harp bridge. It's a lovely little image of where things are today. So there we are. We come forward to the present day, and we can all take a little breath, and then we have to go in our third direction. And so to help us in our third direction, here's Patrick Quinn in full-on bardic fantasy. So Patrick Byrne in full-on bardic fantasy mode, because you have to think. What do we do then? We've seen how the mainstream goes backwards from Patrick Quinn in the old indigenous Irish Gaelic harp lineage back to medieval times. We've seen how the new invention completely takes over and comes forward to the present day. Okay? And yet that's not what we're interested in here. And I try and imagine how these I've talked about, I've used cultural tags, and this is an experimental diagram that I'd like feedback on at some point. And so what I started doing was drawing connections of influence between cultural phenomena. And so here's Patrick Byrne in his Harp Society School. Could you read this text? Is it clear enough? I have printed copies, but can you hand these out, please? As quick as possible. So Patrick Byrne and the Harp Society Schools, late 18th and early 19th century Irish harpers who get their tradition from 17th and 18th century Irish harpers, e.g. Carolan and Connellan, who get their tradition from medieval Gaelic harpers in Ireland and Scotland, who get their tradition from prehistoric and early medieval Gaelic string music, which gets its origins lost in the mists of the time. Is that fair enough? That's a brief history of the Irish harp tradition. And then here is the contemporary Irish and Scottish harp traditions. And it kind of goes back to the 70s folk revivals, And that goes back to the 19th and early 20th century Gaelic revivals, James Fall in Belfast, and that kind of thing. And the 19th one, Egan and those kind of things. And that goes back to English and French pedal harp makers, because that's where Egan gets his ideas from, that's where the traditions of gut strings and semitone mechanisms come from. And that goes back to Renaissance and Baroque German harp traditions, the Bohemian traditions, and that goes back to medieval harpers all across continental Europe, and that goes back to ancient and early medieval European string music, which has got its origins lost in the mist of time. And is that fair stereotype of where that Anglo-classical style of music comes from? And then I think that's terrifyingly stereotyped to draw its two columns like that. Can we not make it more subtle than that? Can we not find, you know, because a lot of people in the contemporary Irish Scottish harp tradition say, yeah, but what about Caroline? What about the medieval harpers? What about... And so I spent a lot of time saying, well, yeah, well, where does the line go from here to here? And I can't find a connection. I can't find any people in contemporary 70s, 19th, early 20th century revivals who get their learning and tradition from people on that side. I don't
Maybe
think...
it's one step removed, that you get the people on the left, and then some of that music goes into the tradition, and the modern harpers are sometimes learning tunes from fiddlers and pipers.
Yes, so repertory definitely crosses over. But the thing is, you see, is that same repertory goes into the fiddle tradition, and you wouldn't consider fiddle to be part of, I'm talking about the harp lineages, you see, or it goes into the piano tradition, or whatever. And so I don't see repertory crossing from one tradition to another as meaning the tradition has a lineage. And I'm trying to be quite careful about what I mean by the lineage of the tradition. The passing on of the whole package of instrument style, teaching, the teaching from master to student, the apprenticeship system that you have in any tradition, where you get your ideas, your aesthetics from.
Possibly in the plain chant world, with
the
Irish connection with the development of plain chant.
So the higher up you go, the less we know, and the more possible it is that there's ziggy-zaggy crossings over, okay? But it's very crude stereotype, but it's where I'm at the moment, okay? And I am actively looking for lines that go in this direction, because I'd love to redraw this image with connecting lines, but at the moment I'm not able to.
From right to left, but left to right, either way.
All right.
Where would you put, you'd have to put a line or some kind of, you would think something for the 1970s folk revival, people who were making Irish drum harps.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But they don't learn from anyone who is. They haven't been studying under anyone who's studying under these. I'm talking about the inherited tradition of teacher to pupil, okay? And they don't have that. That's what I'm looking for. Okay. So where we are at the very end of things, okay, is that at the Historical Harp Society of Ireland, we look at contemporary Irish and Scottish harp traditions, and we think this is not the old Irish harp tradition, because it's over here, it comes over here. What we want to be here, okay? We want to be here, but we can't be because there's no line coming down from the Harp Society schools. It comes to a full stop, okay? We want to be here, but how do it's like a family tree, you know? You know, I would love to be the son of somebody, but I'm not, and I can't make it so. Okay? I can't go back in time and make them have descendants that I can be descended from. Okay, so what do we do? And this is the task and the subject matter of Scoil and the Historical Harp Society of Ireland, is to work out how to get here, how to make that happen. Okay? And so what we have is a kind of early music, historical archaeological, musicological research project to put up research and historical hooks up into this thing and pull down, okay, to try and, I don't know whether to pull that down or lift ourselves up. And what I did a workshop on this the other day, and we were talking about this, and we were thinking, anytime you try and take something from here, you think, oh, that's easier, because look, it's the same, it's closer in time. Anytime you put a hook here and pull, you don't pull that thing over to you, you pull yourself over to there. Okay, so this is the great temptation, is to go, oh, let's take a bit from this tradition to help us on our way. And I always fear that if we end up being pulled over to there. Okay, so what I think we're trying to do is to pull ourselves up to here. So this ends up being our working method, okay? We look back in time, we say, what information can we get in the present day that will help us connect to those older strands of tradition? And this is it, basically. Here's Patrick Quinn, here's his portrait, showing his posture, his hand position, his orientation, his physical bearing, you can always see his emotional response to what he's doing. Here's his actual harp. We can go to the museum, we can see the actual musical instrument that he played with the wear marks of his wrists on the wood, with the scratches where he dragged it through doorways. We can commission harp makers to measure it and to make accurate measured replicas. We can string it, we can get it working. And then we can get Edward Bunting's notebooks of Queen's, we can get copies of them, we can work out what pages are the field transcripts of Patrick Quinn's playing, we can work out what pages represent his actual sounds, transcribed onto dots by Edward Bunting in the early 1800s, and then we can just put them together. We can get the replica harp, we can sit ourselves at it, copying the posture, copying the hand position, the orientation, the way of holding your head and your knee and your hand and your wrist, and we can try and play these actual notes and see what happens. And what kind of tends to happen is that it kind of starts to work and you start to get glimpses of a sound world that doesn't fit into the Anglo-continental modern folk side of things, but suddenly starts to remind you of Sean Ross singing and old-fashioned uilleann piping and old traditional fiddle styles, and then you start to think, maybe this is working. Except that there are hundreds and hundreds of pages of Bunting's manuscripts, and there are 20 old harps, and there are 10 portraits of harpers, and it's all scattered, and it hasn't been properly indexed and collated and studied and everything, and there's a lifetime's work for armies of scholars to grapple with this material and bring it all together. And that's what we're here for, I guess. And I have to say that Anne Hayman is one of the reasons we're here, because she was one of the first people to do this. And so Anne had a copy of Patrick Quinn's harp, and she went to Queen's and she looked at Bunting's manuscripts, and was one of the first people to find these tunes in the manuscripts and to take what the manuscript said seriously, and to apply them, and to copy the posture, and to copy the orientation, and to start doing this work. And still does, and we're all inspired by that. And so it carries on, and here we are last year, here in the Pobble, sitting with replicas of different 18th century Irish harps, and studying the manuscripts, and talking about the posture, and the orientation, and hand position, the playing techniques, and trying to get it all working. And sometimes it seems like we've only just started, but sometimes it seems like it's almost working, and so we carry on. Thank you.